All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's actually so fascinating to see the faces in the room and the names on the Zoom right now. And so many of my worlds colliding in one place. So this is really special. So thank you all for being here. Um, this is a culmination of my master's thesis, investigation into engagement and access in the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the agenda, um, we're going to start off with a visualization exercise. It may not be very hard for people that, work and live in the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region to see this, but if we can take a moment to kind of imagine a space where you have biodiversity, rich cultural diversity, you have people of differing backgrounds, different political stances, right? All working together in a way to not only protect the environment, but also to produce social cohesion across the space. This is actually an image of the Lake Champlain, which is a central part of the Champlain-Adirondack Biosphere region, of course. So this kind of vision of a cohesive space where nature and humans coexist and actually are not seen as separate from each other is why I came to ESF and why I wanted to study biosphere reserves. They're a concept that focuses on bridging human nature relationships, is the quote I remember reading when I first discovered biosphere regions. And through a series of serendipitous happenstances, I ended up at ESF, which is one of the few schools in the United States that actually produces degrees around biosphere reserve studies. For instance, we have the Center for Bioregional and Biosphere Reserve Studies, which is here within the Landscape Architecture department. And so within being here, I moved from Georgia and came up to New York State to work at, or excuse me, not work at, but to study at ESF, which is, as we know, on the ancestral lands of the Onondaga. And I was able to also explore the Biosphere region, which is also the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral lands in which we currently stand and where I've studied. So to now kind of get into the nitty-gritty of my research, what did I do when I was in the Adirondacks, as I was here in the classrooms? I studied engagement and access for the biosphere reserves, the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. And so here's just a brief agenda in terms of what we're going to be going through today. All right, so I will start with a background for the UNESCO program and the Man and Biosphere program. Then we'll kind of do a timeline looking nationally at the US Man and Biosphere program before kind of focusing on US biosphere regions and the site that I'm studying, the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region. Of course, we'll go into the research questions. So what was I actually studying? And then bring in the framework that was kind of helping me understand the data that came up. Then we'll go into this actual study itself, which is an overview of the methods. We'll do an overview of the content that came up during my interviews, as well as the actual analysis method I use, reflexive thematic analysis, which we'll talk about later, and then the results that came out of that analysis and the recommendations that I develop as part of my study. Of course, we'll end with further studies because we can always, advance the science. There's always more to do, more to learn, more to address, and then limitations. So kind of, the constraints that I had within my study. And then finally acknowledge everyone in this room and people that helped me with this study. So to start off with talking about the Man and Biosphere program, why was it founded? We want to go actually all the way back to the end of World War II and the devastation that happened after or as a result of World War II. The world powers then decided to focus on international collaboration and peace building and founded the United Nations and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So how can we do international collaborations through education, through science, and through culture? In 1971, there now became a focus on doing ecosystem-based collaboration through the Man in the Biosphere program. And the biosphere reserves would be the actual physical sites to carry out the initiatives for the program. So, what are biosphere reserves? What are their missions? We have biosphere reserves, which are these sites, like, as I said, physical sites, where we have a kind of laundry list of activities. We have conservation happening here. We have interdisciplinary research, environmental monitoring, training of researchers, demonstration of research, as well as environmental education and local participation for the management of the biosphere. These kind of criteria were developed by Michel Batisse, who is kind of seen to be the brainiac behind the Biosphere Reserve concept. So now kind of moving down from the international global organization to thinking about how the organization worked at the national level, we'll do a timeline of the US Man and Biosphere, which is a timeline I've adapted from Jennifer Thompson's timeline. So we'll start off with the trajectory phase, which is when the first biosphere reserves were designated in 1976. This first phase was known as the living laboratories phase, so really emphasized the research component for the three concerns of the program, which were conservation, logistics, and development. So in this kind of living laboratories phase, it was really focused on conserving genetic material and also focused on doing international research collaborations. Human development, of course, was a focus, but the people piece, which we'll talk about later, kind of really emerged and became stronger later on. And so this is actually an image of the Biosphere Reserve. And so what they've kind of landed on for a site model is a fried egg, where you have a yolk, which is the core area in the United States. These core areas often overlaps national parks. And then they would actually expand beyond just the conserved area to focus on human engagement with that conserved area and those zones were the buffer zone and the transition zone. The buffer zones were activities or human settlements that were more aligned with conservation goals. And then we had that transition zone where you see more villages, more cities, and more human activity. So this biosphere reserve is unique because we're not just focusing on conserved areas, we're thinking about the surrounding space and how it interacts with the conserved area. All right, so now the stabilization phase. This is after the golden age, which was the trajectory phase. Now all these collaborations that are happening between the Forest Service and the National Park Service, which were spearheading the program, are actually now informing land management practices. So that's what's happening nationally. Internationally, we now have a shift to include the more people place or people piece, excuse me, with the CVA strategy in 1995 which was looking at the 21st century. So really big picture strategy planning. And they finalized a statutory framework for the World Network of Biosphere Reserves to kind of create something a little more concrete for how biosphere reserves should be designated, what the activities are going to be, and that kind of thing. And then they actually established a new role for biosphere reserves to actually participate in sustainable development, which is Agenda 21, and conservation on biological diversity. So trying to see biosphere reserves as a key player in these international environmental agreements, rather than being a separate component to that. So you'll see the American Land Sovereignty Protection Act, this image up here. So this is kind of funny in a way because it's actually in a foil to what was happening internationally. Internationally, we're focusing more on people, right? But on the national level, people were actually getting upset at this UNESCO designation process. You had UNESCO World Heritage Sites and UNESCO Biosphere Reserves that were essentially seen as ways for the UN to implement or impact their power on local and state land. So folks were actually seeing or perceiving rather that the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and Biosphere Reserves were going to be restricting what they could do with their land, that they were going to have to achieve these national goals that the UNESCO has tagged along to. So this is kind of a black helicopter conspiracy in a way, where there's this world power that's trying to implement itself and have jurisdiction over local land. That was not the case. UNESCO doesn't have any jurisdiction on the land. It's more of the biosphere reserve managers that wanted to achieve or push toward these international collaborations and agreements. But this was kind of a miscommunication and also a feeling of like land is being not necessarily, but man is being impacted negatively. And so a big key part of this misunderstanding, as I see it, is this lack of public engagement or proper engagement with the people during the designation process. And this is actually a quote during the forum from the Act when they did the committee meetings, and I'm just going to read it out for everyone. So, also disturbing is that the designation of world biospheres and world heritage sites rarely involve consulting the public and local governments. At the five hearings held on the American Land Sovereignty Protection Act, state and local elected officials, as well as grassroots citizen activists from Alaska, Arkansas, Missouri, Minnesota, New Mexico, and New York, testified that no one consulted with the public or local governments when international land designations were made in their states. So there's this issue of we're not talking to the public, and that's actually taking roots to become and elevating to a federal level. And so this of course led into a jolt period where the Biosphere Reserve program starts to decline. Leaders that were initially kind of spearheading the program retire, and programmatic oversight is moved from Congress, or excuse me, moved from the State Department to the U.S. Forest Service, which didn't have much capacity to run it. And then the Forest Service relinquishes its role, and the program becomes essentially inactive. I will note here that although it's inactive at the national level, there was an active presence on the global stage. Most importantly, there were more than a dozen US delegates, actually 20 US delegates that attended the Third World Congress of Biosphere Reserves that was in Madrid, Spain, in I believe 2008. So despite national sentiment against the Biosphere Reserve program, these still individuals are participating on this global stage. And now to the present. So we're in the Reformation stage. So the State Department took re-interest in 2013 in revitalizing the program and reestablished the U.S. MAP National Committee in 2015. They actually had UNESCO MAP representatives come to the United States to help revitalize these biosphere sites in preparation for a periodic review process. So UNESCO requires biosphere reserves to conduct a periodic review process every, I believe it's 10 years, in order to essentially indicate, hey, we're still here, we're still doing the things that you want us to do, we're meeting the criteria, we're doing the activities set forth in the strategic plan. And so in 2017, we had the periodic review process, but 17 sites either could not renew because they didn't have capacity or just weren't interested or didn't meet the criteria. And so we currently have 28 biosphere regions existing in the United States. And just to go back, sorry, really quickly to the previous slide, just to talk about how important the periodic review process is. This helps revitalize the program in a lot of ways because Biosphere Reserve managers needed to reach out to individuals, whether that's local communities, local government, not-for-profits, to form collaboratives to actually initiate and move forward the program. So in the process of doing periodic reviews, you actually are meeting the people in your space and developing and strengthening a network. So now to talk about this current phase we're in, it's a little bit strange, or it's a little bit difficult to kind of know where we're at because, we have the United States Biosphere Network, which is strong. It's a not-for-profit volunteer organization that's helping run the national program and helping regions at the local level. But we also have the United States declaring its removal from UNESCO. So we were just in UNESCO, we just decided to rejoin under the Biden administration, and now in this administration, the Trump administration, we are leaving again. So where does that leave us with the program? Are we facing another jolt period? Does that mean we're going to, as the program is going to decline? I am of the personal stance that it's not going to decline, especially if we focus on engaging people at the local level. If we engage people at the regional level, if we engage people within the biosphere region, we can have rich biosphere reserves that actually do the initiatives. But nationally, there might be a different might be a different opinion. So it's kind of similar to that stabilization phase where we had individuals that were actually attending and participating in the global stage, although the national program wasn't operating as strongly. So this is kind of what I want to kind of convince or recommend to the biosphere reserves here in the United States. So which biosphere reserve did I study? Of course, we all know the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Region, the biosphere region in our backyard. ESF has several satellite campuses within the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Region, making it a great institution for me to actively understand the space in which I'm studying. And so the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Region was designated in 1989. It includes the Adirondack Park, as well as the New York and Vermont portions of the Lake Champlain watershed, as well as the Quebec water portion. You can see that here at the top, and as well as the portion of the Green Mountain National Forest. So to talk a little bit about the region's outward-facing initiatives, there are several initiatives within the region that focus on trying to engage the public. So you have Biosphere in Your Backyard, which was a campaign to get people to celebrate the place that they were in. You have the Atlas for Climate and Environmental Change, which is a climate atlas to help inform land management practices and decision making. And then you also have agricultural education initiatives as well. So there's a lot of outward-facing community engagement happening within the region. Uh, Despite that, I did a SWOT analysis for the region last summer and discovered that there's still gaps in holes with how they engage. There's certain individuals or certain sectors, like the public sector, that are not represented in the Biosphere Network membership. There are local communities that are not represented in the Biosphere Network leadership. And so I wanted to kind of get an understanding of how best to improve the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network's engagement strategies. And who else better to ask than people that have a pulse on local communities? And so I asked folks that were in the public sector and folks that were in the not-for-profit sector that dealt with very heavily with outward-facing initiatives, whether that's renewable energy, whether that's housing developments, to get an understanding of what are the barriers and opportunities for engagement across this vast biosphere region. So the research questions, what are the existing strategies for public engagement and public participation? So what are people already doing, what already works, right? And then what are people already doing that don't work as much? And then what are the barriers and opportunities to public engagement and public participation? And these two questions, I then kind of coalesce to form recommendations for the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. So to take a note, just a sidebar on a framework. So when I was doing the SWOT analysis, there was a lot about trying to engage people that didn't automatically have a great we weren't an obvious choice for for the network. So you worked with biodiversity conservation, you worked with sample development. It doesn't automatically make sense to maybe reach to the union workers within the space, right? Despite them living in the region. And so I wanted to understand how better to build relationships and better build trust, especially thinking about the American Land Sovereignty Protection Act, with people in the network. And so I actually had a wonderful friend, Beth Beswell, who recommended this framework to me, Susan Seneca's Trinity of Voice framework, which essentially looks at how people are providing access or how people are given access to a particular participatory process, whether or not they are given civic standings, whether or not their opinion matters in the space, and how they actually influence the outcomes. And so this framework, I just want to make a note, is not the kind of structure for the thesis. I just was curious to see if my interviews would actually have anything in relation to this framework. So I wanted to just put them in conversation. So we'll see that later on. All right, so to kind of go into the study now, what did I actually do and how did I do it? So I did semi-structured interviews for individuals that were engaged in the biosphere region, those that were not engaged. Another way to say this is aware and not aware, right? So those who are engaged were those who are on steering committee, that were members of the steering committee, those that were interns perhaps, and then not engaged were people that might have heard about it or seen a post about it or, read about it online, but weren't actively involved in any of the initiatives. And this was for the purposes of seeing if there was any kind of mismatch in terms of strategies that worked for the network but didn't necessarily work for people in the region. If there was things that the individuals in the network said didn't work. So just trying to get a breadth of understanding of engagement. And then using those transcripts, I did reflexive thematic analysis following Brown and Clark's guidebook from 2021 to develop themes or results, and which would further develop my recommendations. So to kind of get an understanding of who I was talking to or what they were talking about. So these were the modes of public participation or engagement that often came up in my interviews. Informative seminars, annual meetings were often come up or often brought up. Civil boards were ways that people engage the public. And these were on a breadth of issues between renewable energy, housing development, regional planning, youth advisory boards even. And so this is just a small kind of selection of things that came up, but just to kind of help you all visualize what everyone was or what people were talking about in their interviews and where I'm pulling the information from. So to kind of briefly go through the analysis process, I am a novice social science researcher. My background is chemistry, and so things of reflexivity and thematic analysis, I am not super well versed in. And so I actually took this approach of doing manual coding to kind of get me into the groove before going into the more software, um, the the software. So step one for familiarization, I just did a low and slow where I would read a transcript, no memos, read another transcript, and then I would read the first one again. So kind of doing iterative where for every new transcript I read, I would read the previous ones, right? So I could kind of get an understanding of what new things were coming up. I did initial coding through highlighting manually, and then I would put those manual codes into the MaxQDA software for generating themes. I've spared you all by not showing you the mind map that I use for the codes, but that was step 4 and 5 of defining and trying to find reliability for these themes and how they actually coalesce together. And then step 6, we're currently in, which is the reporting portion of this. So thank you for participating in my research. So what came out? What were the results? What were the themes? They came into 4 broad categories. So who is participating? We have participation as privilege and cluing into who is missing. What is meaningful participation? It's more than checking a box. And what are strategies for engagement? Meeting people where they're at. That's a quote that came up very often. And then how to engage youth for the Biosphere region. It was very important that I focus on youth engagement. I am the Youth Board Chair for the United States Biosphere Network. And so regularly I would ask my interviewees, where are the young people? What are they doing? How are they engaging? Are they engaging well? Who are they? And so that also became a theme for my research. So to focus or to first start with participation of the privilege, interviewees often kind of describe the same type of person that showed up to their decision-making opportunities or their engagement opportunities. They were often retired, they were or white, senior professionals, they were well-educated at the graduate level, affiliated with a college or institution, or were organizational leaders that had essentially a programmatic directive to be there in the space. And so what happened here was I was noticing that what people define as a coalition of the willing, it was not that folks that weren't in the room weren't willing to be there. It was folks that were actually privileged with time and resources that were actually in the space and dictating decision-making outcomes. So to kind of go into now cluing into missing who's not in the space, I wanted to discuss challenges and broader engagement. It was regularly they mentioned working individuals are not showing up, families are not showing up, and young people are not showing up. Oftentimes we'd say, oh, just the meeting times are awkward, they don't work, and that just didn't seem sufficient to me. It's more than just, a meeting time doesn't work with someone's schedule. It's more of what I found folks that, are working, that are families, that are young people that aren't privileged again with this time and energy. are extremely busy. They're constantly negotiating between their lives, whether that's taking care of their family or going to work. They can't take off the day because they just started this job, with going to a participation opportunity or going to engage somewhere. And this was a quote from Hayden, which really stuck out to me, which was, we're almost at this point where we've backed ourselves as a society into hyper busyness in a way that we are incapacitated. We actually can't do anything. We can't show up. And we can't take those 15 minutes to engage. You need people to take that 15 minutes, but it's that or nothing. And so this will go in later in terms of, if everyone is hyper busy, then what is valuable participation? How should we then change what's valuable and what's not valuable if just taking a moment is so difficult? So I'm making a point about working families and youth. They have an insight into economic livelihoods, into education, into community health, but they're not in the space. And so it's necessary, it's my recommendation that the Biosphere Network, the Biosphere Network actually creates opportunities that are for that people that are missing in the room. And so I wanted to actually visualize this with a spectrum of allies where the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network is engaging people that are active allies or people that are already within their personal and professional networks. They're not reaching out to people that are seemingly maybe on the outside and the outskirts of what makes sense for the network. And so, getting representation in play, it is challenging, but it's not impossible and it's also worth it. And so the network can be intentional about creating opportunities that are accessible for a variety of demographics, whether that's providing wraparound services. One participant mentioned that, she was very involved in the local community. She even was a member of the select board, but, when taking care of children, she just was unable to participate in the way that she wanted to and needed wraparound services to actually help her get in the room and be able to participate. So I'm making the recommendation here that the Biosphere Network should lean into the neutral and passive opposition in their public outreach campaigns like the Biosphere in Your Backyard to improve public awareness of the Biosphere region's history, activities, and missions. All right, the next theme is more than checking a box, so meaningful participation. Creating opportunities in which stakeholders feel heard is central to meaningful processes, but it is challenging. We have federal and state mandates for public participation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if someone is fulfilling these federal and state mandates, that the people that are coming into the room are actually feeling like they're impacting the outcomes. And so facilitators, the participants or individuals that I interviewed would say that, we need to be given access early. Don't give us access on the ninth stage of a process because we actually can't impact the outcomes. Show us that the input is impacting the project outcomes. Even if you didn't do exactly what we said or wanted, show us that you at least considered what we were telling you. And then being transparent about the project outcome. So you made a decision. Why did you make that decision? Right. So those link directly to Seneca's Trinity of Voice of, providing access, showing civic standing, and showing the influence of individuals who participate. And this was a wonderful quote about just trying to create a space for people to actually feel like they're being heard and feel like they can come back. And so it's my recommendation or my thoughts that Champlain Adirondack needs to be a space to actually have people want to come to share their voice and want to come back. Don't just, get public input and then make it so unbearable that people don't want to participate again or don't even want to read, the outcome. So the network is not, mandated to public engage, right? Because it's a volunteer organization. But by facilitating participatory processes, they're actually going to be able to get a breadth of understanding across the region and be able to fulfill the Biosphere Reserve concept, which is focused on that collaboration. And so if the network is to generate trust and to avoid that kind of feeling of black helicopter and loss of rights, they need to actually engage with the stakeholders in the regions, the communities, the organizations, and local governments. And in doing that, offer multiple entry points for the stakeholders' voices to be heard, embrace the perspective of stakeholders in managing the biosphere region, and share how stakeholders impact the management of the biosphere region. And then finally, we have meeting people where they're at. This was a really exciting and recurring theme to me that was kind of embodied in a lot of different ways. You had people meeting people where they're at in terms of finding like the physical community, and then you had meeting people where they're at when it comes to like finding their values and meeting them there. And so, and finding the community, you have, digital and physical meeting people where they're at. It's important to note with the digital that a lot of the region doesn't have broadband access. So is that really accessible if we don't have broadband access? Not quite, but it does. We have to admit that Zoom, as we can see right now, has made things more accessible in a lot of ways. But in finding the community, there is a general lack of public spaces and meeting spaces across the region. It's a rural region. You have libraries and maybe community hubs that are actually the hosts for a lot of events. And so the lack of meeting spaces makes it difficult to find people and actually engage with them. And so in order to kind of counteract that, individuals would piggyback off of events with larger audiences. So festivals or conferences and excuse me, local libraries were also a kind of major site for engaging with folks. Social entrepreneurs were also key. Some individuals called them community champions or community leaders. These are folks that are very trusted within the space, within the region, within the town, and could encourage local buy-in, promote outcomes, and help initiatives gain traction. Oftentimes, local leaders, community leaders, would help an individual recruit for a select board, for instance, or would help generate buy-in for a renewable energy projects. So these are the people that are really pushing forward an initiative. And engaging with social entrepreneurs, you're able to actually engage the entire community. So the next piece is finding the values. So where are people kind of coming into a particular project, or where are they actually engaging with a particular idea? It's important to gain traction on a project by connecting a weird coalition of people. And I have a great example of one participant who mentioned a wastewater management facility who had a coalition of people who wanted to get beer on a Friday, who wanted to go kayak on the river, and folks that wanted, affordable housing. And the reason that was because, you had folks that wanted to go on the river and didn't want to, of course, recreate in a dirty river. You had folks whose bar was threatened to shut down, because they couldn't afford to do their own personal wastewater management facility for the site. And then you had folks that realized, hey, if we get a wastewater management facility, we can actually have affordable housing. And so you had people that were coming into this one particular project from very different angles. No one was super gung-ho about the wastewater management facility in particular. They're gung-ho about, the impacts of that. And so it's necessary to actually engage people around their points of entry into an issue. Additionally, encouraging relevant good behavior, like reducing emissions, is done not through the kind of thou shalt language that is often used in by conservation agencies or organizations, but it's through language of belonging, language of traditions, language of livelihoods. There's an example of one individual who was able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by marketing to individuals or telling individuals that, they're able to make their home more comfortable, they're able to reduce the cost of their bills. That was a lot more effective than telling them you can help fight climate change, because climate change was a hot button word for that region. And so using phrases that are highly politicized in the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region is not going to get you further. It's not going to encourage good relevant behavior. What's going to encourage good relevant behavior is values and phrases that are actually relatable. Of course, we don't want to dilute the science, but if we're trying to actually get to a particular outcome, then let's get to the particular outcome. And so my recommendation here is to change the discussion. Use relatable language that helps identify the values of local communities and stakeholders. I want to take this quote from Parker, who talked about changing the discussion around climate change. He didn't ask about climate, he asked about weather. And the participants, these were farmers in that space or in the area, started to open up about what was happening with the weather. You know, the hailstorms were knocking off buds. Their lake didn't freeze, so they couldn't do ice fishing. They couldn't do logging because the forests were too mushy. And, you know, the ice fishing here is underlined because that indicates several different potential values. That indicates values of subsistence. It indicates values of alternative economic livelihoods. It indicates values of winter recreation, right? So those are what's important to the person, not necessarily climate change, but the impacts of climate change. So again, engaging people around the impacts, focusing on the values that they have. So the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network is a UNESCO program, and they do engage in this kind of not legalese, but you know, a form of that when it comes to the international stage, in a language that is kind of provocative to folks in the biosphere region. And so they serve as a translator between the international dialogue and the local dialogue. And so it's important at the regional level for the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region. I recommend or I advise that they actually frame around these values of livelihood, recreation, or economic profit, economic livelihoods because it has the potential to bolster public support for initiatives such as climate change mitigation. All right, so finally, I can get on my soapbox and put on my youth board chair hat and talk about youth in the Biosphere region and why youth engagement is so important within Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region and Biosphere regions generally, especially those that are rural. Um, you know, there are several, and within the interviews, several individuals noted that young adults were not engaged in their community scale participatory practices. And there were multiple reasons for this. Young people are leaving the region, they're going to college, they're joining the military. There aren't really economic benefits, there aren't social benefits, there aren't things that, you know, are as attractive as cities like Albany or New York or Syracuse. And so they're leaving. And so this is not just an issue for Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region, this is an issue for rural America at large. Young people are leaving the region, the regions are aging, you're having a smaller and smaller working population. And so it's important to develop initiatives around youth engagement to actually create a sort of stickiness for young people to stay and actually promote or excuse me, to stay and actually be trained to contribute, not understanding, but contribute capacity to the region. So just to talk about the influx of out-of-state residents, a lot of rural areas are actually increasing the population from folks coming outside. So now they have to negotiate with people that are not just citizens of their space or grew up in the space, but also have outsider, quote unquote, perspectives. A lot of those folks being millennials. So with the declining labor force, there are, excuse me, um, realizing that's a little bit off here, but the point here is just that rural regions like the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region are facing issues when it comes to their population and need to have initiatives around youth engagement. And so there needs to be recruitment and retention for folks that were born in this space and folks that are coming into this space. Um, all right, excuse me. All right, so the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region, you know, manages skill building opportunities. For myself, excuse me, an example for myself is, you know, being involved the youth board. I've been able to actually go to Germany. I'm planning to go to China and actually engage globally and professionally develop. And so these opportunities should be provided to individuals across the region, youth across the region, because they have the energy and they have new perspectives that can contribute to the network's participatory processes and the network's management. And so I also want to kind of focus less on youth the way that the UNESCO defines it, which is 18 to 35, and think about young people as in K through 12, so the young people like the toddlers and the middle schoolers and high schoolers. It's important for there to be initiatives focused on them, considering how often young people leave the region to go to college or leave the region to find employment opportunities elsewhere. If you're able to actually engage young people, as the Archipelago Sea Area Biosphere does with their education initiatives, if you're able to engage young people around the concept of biosphere reserves early, then you're kind of generating a sense of pride and understanding and appreciation that could potentially keep them in the space and contribute to greater capacity in the region. All right, so this study was conducted within 2 years, right, across a large, very large biosphere region. And so I had some limitations in terms of who I was able to talk to, how long, and what I was able to study. And in the framing of community engagement and public engagement, the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network has a outward-facing campaign, the Biosphere in Your Backyard. And so it'd be great to see, folks that actually engaged in the campaign and were recipients of the campaign grants, how that actually improved awareness within their program and improved awareness within the people they talked to. And so I feel that that could be a whole nother separate study and an expansion of what exists currently. And then another limitation, or further study, excuse me, is engaging with the Canadian portion of the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. I engaged with the network or with the New York and the Vermont portion, but there is a portion in Quebec that should also be engaged, especially to strengthen Canadian and US relations. This also includes Frontenac Arch, which has a twinning agreement with the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. And so engaging with the Frontenac Arch Biosphere region and members of that network would also kind of help to understand transnational collaborations. Wonderful. So this is kind of concluding the presentation at this point. I just want to acknowledge Stacey Hines for helping me with this presentation and kind of getting all the visuals together. This would have been extremely text heavy without him. Emmanuel Carter, who is the reason I came to ESF for many reasons, not withstanding the fact that he's an extremely wise person when it comes to regional planning and trying to actually get bioregionalism um, out in front and center in front of people. My friends are in this space, the folks that are coming from Cranberry Lake who actually helped me push this thesis over the finish line, as well as Sarah and Jonathan who gave me advice on this presentation. The people that are on this Zoom, hello, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for support from my family and from my friends, Shirja and Beth, who were not able to be here in person. Thank you all for kind of holding my hand throughout this and cheering me on when I just, when it got scary, right? So thank you to everyone that is here, and I am more than welcome or more than happy to welcome questions.